evening, and welcome to Medill. My name is Lauren Velasco, and I'm a senior majoring in journalism with a minor in political science and hopes of becoming a political reporter. It's an honor to be introducing such a prestigious news organization today. Now, more than ever, it's crucial to recognize and appreciate the journalism organizations working to inform and inspire the world, including budding journalists like me. My journey in Medill has been filled with thoughtful conversations and immersive experiences. It's taken me from learning about the intersection of media and technology in San Francisco to meeting esteemed journalists at the New York Times Bureau in Tokyo. Outside of class, I have been able to represent Medill as an intern at the Today Show and currently at the NBC News Midwest Bureau in Chicago. I am also a proud member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, furthering a mission to diversify news. Diversity goes hand in hand with excellent reporting today. The expression and acknowledgement of different views, backgrounds, and identities helps us as reporters have a voice in an increasingly diversified world. I believe one of the most important parts of being a journalist is being an observer of humanity. We must first understand who we are to each other in order to make a difference. Our job as communicators to the rest of the world is one of the most vital jobs that exists. If it were not for the panelists we will be hearing from today, I don't think I'd be where I am now, striving to further this mission. I'd like to thank PBS's Judy Woodruff for being here to inspire us and remind us why we choose journalism, why we choose humanity, and above all, why we choose truth. Thank you to our panelists and to all of you for coming out tonight. Now I'm happy to introduce to you the Chief Content Officer at WTTW, Dan Soules.
So glad you're here tonight. Thank you, Lauren, for the kind introduction. As Lauren said, I'm Dan Soules. I'm Chief Television Content Officer for WTTW. And I want to start by thanking Northwestern and Medill for being such wonderful hosts and being such terrific partners. This event is special because we're doing it here on this wonderful campus. As the media industry evolves and experiences incredible change, Medill continues to be a leading force in educating a new generation of multimedia journalists. And I think from some of the questions you're going to hear tonight, from some of the students, you're going to see just how much of an impact a Medill education has in today's society. I also want to recognize WTTW members and trustees that are here tonight in the audience. Programs like the PBS NewsHour, Frontline, Chicago Tonight, they're not possible without the support of our viewers and donors. So thank you so much for making possible what you see tonight. For doing journalism in the public interest is our driving mission, and because of you, it's possible. So we're very grateful for that. So an applause to our members, please. Tonight I have the great pleasure of introducing our special guests. Every night as anchor and managing editor of the PBS NewsHour, Judy Woodruff delivers on the promise of trusted, objective, in-depth reporting for audiences here in Chicago and throughout the country, not just on WTTW, but all the PBS stations from coast to coast. Judy has covered politics and other news for more than 4 decades at NBC, CNN, and of course at PBS. She is founding co-chair of the International Women's Media Foundation, an organization dedicated to promoting and encouraging women in journalism, and is a recipient of the Poynter Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Journalism, and has also received someone who's near and dear to all our hearts in public media, the Gwen Ifill Press Freedom Award and the Cronkite Award for Excellence in Journalism. Judy is going to be joined by Northwestern's very own Ava Thompson Greenwell. She teaches video journalism here and has served as an associate dean and department chair right here at Medill. She is a co-director of the school's South Africa Journalism Residency Program, and she's currently in a production on a documentary I'm very excited about, A Mission Possible, Chicago's Free South Africa Movement, a historical documentary. I've met with her a number of times about the film. I can't wait to show it on WTTW and come back here and screen the film when it's completed. I think it's going to be a really important story. Her research interests focus on the intersection of race, gender, and journalism. She has worked as a reporter in cities around the country, as a freelance correspondent with us at WTTW and also at WGN. And finally, but not least, my colleague, Amanda Vinicky. She's a correspondent for WTTW News and Chicago Tonight, and a segment host who focuses on Illinois government and politics. Amanda joined us on the Chicago Tonight team after spending a decade as a State House bureau chief for NPR Illinois and the Illinois Public Radio Network. Her work and analysis have been featured on Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and The Takeaway, and she has garnered a number of honors, including from the Illinois Associated Press and the Association of Capitol Reporters and Editors. It's a wonderful panel. We're going to have a very thoughtful conversation, and we're going to hear your questions as the evening progresses. But before we get started, we have a brief video to show you, and as we show the video, you'll see an example of the power of the NewsHour. I want to welcome our guests, Judy, Amanda, and Ava, to the stage. So please welcome them, and let's take a look at the video. Thank you for coming.
Have you seen anything like this before?
No, absolutely not.
The policeman fired 16 times.
You even had a GOP senator at a budget hearing this afternoon call it a, quote, love fest.
Does it give you some kind of comfort that your critics are coming from both sides?
No, because I could still be wrong.
Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel announced today that he's not running for a third term next year.
It found Pritzker used false affidavits, having toilets removed from the mansion. Yeah, that is pungent.
Claire, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you, and we'll see you soon.
The first trick of broadcasting, getting the microphones to work.
Absolutely.
Testing, testing.
And here I am. Yay, they all work. Success. So again, obviously, my name is Amanda, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. We will have time, as you can probably see from your programs, for audience participation and questions, so get your inner journalist ready, but I will get things started.
But everything you always wanted to ask, you will be able to ask when we're done.
So let's just get things started. And could you tell us about, I know, I told Judy earlier that I actually read her book back from 1982, so I'm feeling very well versed on your early
Amanda
career.
was not born when this book was written, so just so you know.
I don't remember it, but yeah. But could you just talk about when you were getting started? Because I think particularly for some of the students, it will really come as a shock how a career in broadcasting was for women to even just get their foot in the door.
So how far back do we want to go? No, it was first of all, I'm delighted to be here. I have to say this, how wonderful to be back at the Medill School. What a fabulous school, what a fabulous university, and what an amazing program for so many journalists. So I'm thrilled to be here with students and with all of you in the community. This is just a real treat for me. It was decades ago when I started, Amanda. You know that you and I actually, Amanda interviewed me at WTTW earlier this afternoon. It was at a time when there were very few women. I had graduated from Duke University. I had explored, first thinking I'd work in politics, but I was told that women were not welcome in Washington in politics. So I had a professor who said to me, "Did you ever think about covering politics?" So I thought, that's an interesting idea. And I decided Washington was a bit of a reach in terms of starting out a career in journalism. So I applied for jobs in Atlanta. The only jobs available to me were as a secretary. So I interviewed at 3 TV stations, and one of the news directors hired me. And then after I'd been there a few months as the secretary, I said, I'd really like to spend time with the news crew, go out and report, or watch them report, learn on the job. And his response was, well, why would you want to do that? We already have a woman reporter here. But this was the late 1960s, early 1970s, when women were it was scarce. Thank goodness we've come a long way. I will also say that when I started out, we were using film, which some of you have maybe read about. was how we shot. We would go and shoot our stories. I'd go to the state capitol in Atlanta and come back late afternoon, and we would put the film in we called it the soup. It was the processor. 35 to 40 minutes later, it would come out the other end, and I was involved not only in writing the story and reporting all day long, but in editing the story and getting it on the air. So I had a fabulous learning experience. But you know what? What was really important about it was humbling for me to start at the very bottom and to learn that there are it takes many people to put a newscast together. It's not just the person you see on the air. It's the producers, it's the people who work the camera, who do sound, who do research, on and on, management, the electricians, the technicians. It truly takes a village, a community of people working together to make it happen. And I was able to learn that early on.
And particularly at some of those smaller stations, it can be even more difficult because there aren't the resources and people are getting started and learning, and that can be very valuable to get your feet wet, to learn journalism and how to tell a story, all of those elements.
No, that's right. And I mean, I was fortunate, again, I was in Atlanta, which today it would be there was no way I could get a job today in Atlanta, Georgia, a big city like that, coming right out of college. I was just a year and a half out of school. And I came in the door, again, I told the news director, I said, I'll do anything. I'll clean the film, I'll empty the trash, I'll answer your phone calls. And I was happy to do all of those things. But along the way, I was hired after a year and a half as a reporter at another station where I was able to cover politics. And I learned frankly, I had to learn from the bottom level how to report, because I had majored in political science in college, and I didn't know about journalism. I hadn't been lucky to take any of Ava's classes, and I had to learn on the job. I remember one of the messages I got very early on, besides how to hold the microphone and I had an instinct about how to ask questions, but was you're only as good as your last story. I had a producer who said to me, if you ever think you figured anything out in journalism, just remember that you are being judged by every day and every story you report. So I was thrilled to be part of this competitive business, but I learned early on that it is a competitive business, and that's what, it's kind of like, it's the journalism, it's the adrenaline that keeps us
And that is
going.
still a saying that I know I hear frequently.
Still something that we tell our students as well, right? Once they get out
You're
there.
still telling students that.
Still telling that. So there are some things that are tried and true, right? So I'm curious, you've covered just about, I think, every president since Jimmy Carter. Is that
Jimmy
right?
Carter. I covered him in Georgia as governor of Georgia.
So you are in some ways the godmother of political reporting.
Or the grandmother. if
The
you want to say.
godmother. We'll say the godmother of political reporting. You've seen a lot over your time. How would you say covering the president today, how has it changed?
It's night and day. And I can say that because I covered Jimmy Carter, and then I covered Ronald Reagan. I was a White House reporter. And then I joined the NewsHour, what was then the McNeil-era NewsHour, and covered Washington. So by inference, covered the White House through the Bush presidency, the H.W. Bush presidency, the Clinton presidency, the W. Bush presidency, the Obama presidency, and now Donald Trump. And I will tell you, the Trump presidency is night and day different from every other one of those presidents. It's not that they all weren't different. Jimmy Carter came from the South. He brought a group of Georgians with him to the White House. They did some things well. They made history with the Camp David Peace Accords, with the work they did on human rights, but they also made some mistakes as political leaders. And they were not as good, I would say, at managing their image as along comes Ronald Reagan, who came from Hollywood, had that background, knew how to talk to the press, was masterful. And enjoyed it. Masterful at talking to the press, was very managed. The people around Ronald Reagan were very careful to make sure he didn't, make sure there weren't too many opportunities to talk to him. And when you did see him, my friend Leslie Stahl, who was been in the news the last few days because of her, I think, really strong interview she did with President Trump the other day, she tells the great story about when she was covering the White House. It was during the Reagan re-election year of 1984, and she had done a story that she thought was very hard-hitting on how the campaign was not hitting, didn't have the right strategy, that the administration was having budget problems, and she listed all these problems, and yet she told the elements of the story under pictures of President Reagan in front of adoring crowds. So he was on a stage, there were people, they were cheering. And after the story aired that night, she was in her little booth in the press office at the White House. She got a call from Mike Deaver, who was a senior assistant to the president, thanking her for the story. And she said, "What do you mean you're thanking me? I had really tough information in there about the budget and about this and that." And he said, "I know, but the pictures were great." He said, "If you just turn the sound off," he said, "a lot of people don't listen to you, Leslie. They're just looking at the pictures." So it's my way of saying the Reagan people were really good at, at image managing. And just long story short, all these other presidents, Democrats, Republicans, strong points of view on the left, on the right. But this is a president who comes from a different background. We all know it. He had no background in politics. He was a businessman, a real estate developer with a very successful career as a reality TV star. And that's what he brought to the White House. And I think that informs much of his approach to the White House. He is not a student of American history. He is not. He doesn't worry a lot about talking about making historical connections as president. So he's broken the mold, I think it's fair to say, and it has presented a challenge for us as a journalist.
Well, and to me, part of that challenge isn't only adapting to his style, but nonetheless chasing after the meat and potatoes that voters, that citizens need to know about policy, that while Trump may not be inclined to talk about that as much, you still have the answer, have questions that need answers because policy is being made. So how should journalists approach it? And what is your take on, has the media collectively done well in covering President Trump? And how could the media do better?
I'm going to turn that question to Ava, and then I'm going to hear what she has to say, and then I'll comment.
Wow. So just this past week, we had homecoming here at Northwestern, and one of my former students, Peter Alexander, who covers the White House, was here. And so I asked him, I said, what's it like, being in that room? And he said, it is dramatically different. There's a new normal that's in the White House for the press corps there now. So I think one of the key messages that we have to give our students is that you've got to be on your toes, right? You've got to be flexible. You've got to make sure that you are going after the truth. I think that's really the most important thing. We've always talked about and strived for accuracy, but beyond accuracy is still one of those things that we teach a lot and really, really try to encourage students to be as accurate as possible. I don't know how many of you know about the Medill F that we have here at Medill, but if you are a student, you know about the Medill F. And a lot of times people say that seems really harsh to give a student a failing grade just because they had one factual error. But it's something that we've been doing for years, and it's something that we really think encourages students to be on their game. It doesn't mean it's the end of the world because you got a Medill F. It just means that you want to be more careful the next time. So I think accuracy is still one of the most important values that we have to continue to convey to our students and to those who are covering, whether it's the White House or whether it's the courthouse here in Chicago, whether it's City Hall here in Chicago, that accuracy is key.
I completely agree, and I think, in fact, I mean, to address that point and to try to address Amanda's question, what we have to do, I think, as journalists, knowing that this is a president who has denigrated the press, talks about fake news, fake journalism, talks about we reporters being the enemies of the people, which makes my blood boil. I can't stand to even think about that because I know it's not true. I mean, the journalists I know are people who've spent their adult lives dedicated to trying to get to the truth, to trying to understand what's going on in Washington and other parts of the country, and trying to share with the American people the facts, the truth, when we can get to it. I mean, I wish I could think that we could get to the truth every day. Sometimes I think I know that it's harder to get to than a piece of the truth, exactly. But it makes my blood boil, but I strongly believe that it's not our role to get into a contest with the president, that our role is to do our jobs as best we can, to hold public officials accountable when they say something that isn't accurate, to point that out, and we are doing that now. That's not something, frankly, that White House reporters were called on to do before this administration, but now it's become part of the job to not just the president, but others in the administration. It's always been our job. It's not that we shouldn't hold every political leader accountable, but today, I think the American people expect us to hold them accountable. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that to do that in a way that we're not in a personal contest with the president or with any other political leader, that what we're doing is reporting, trying to get the facts straight, and frankly, just moving from one day to the next.
Well, one of the challenges, I think, of the age, and it's in part President Trump, but it's just technology and the way of the world today, is that we have this proliferation of social media. So there is sometimes fake news. There's real fake news out there, intentionally, and also outlets that perhaps are coming at it from a vantage point, but don't make that abundantly clear that they are going in with a position, a political take, and that is not obvious to even a very smart reader who is trying to search out for truthful news. So how can we as a society, and particularly as journalists who are having to stand up for our profession that we so believe in, how do we grapple with that and, in a sense, fight it?
Well, I'll just speak, and I want to hear Ava. I'd like to hear you comment on this too, because you deal with it every day in the reporting that you do. I think what we have to do is, frankly, continue to do what we've been doing, but be more mindful than ever of the fact that we are being closely observed, and that we ourselves are being held to account, and as it should be. I mean, I think people should expect reporters to do a good and honest and fair job. You should hold us accountable. I think, frankly, there's more of a burden today on the consumers of news to look at what are you reading and what are you seeing, and do you know the source of that? Is that a source that you can trust? Is that a source you're familiar with? Or is that something that, just doesn't, frankly, pass the smell test? And I think consumers of news are doing more of that, but we're all in this together. We're all trying to understand what's going on in this country and understand the issues and understand what's important for us, for our children, our grandchildren, and the next generation. And we reporters have our role, but the public has a role, I think, as well, to try to just examine what they read and what they see, what you see, a little bit more closely.
And I think in that examination, in some ways, it will make journalists better, because the more we are watching, that all are watching. But I also think we probably need to go further, and that is, most of us grew up during a time where we really didn't have to be concerned with news literacy. And maybe we got it on our own, maybe we didn't. So, one of the things that I think we should really consider is teaching news literacy and what that really means at a younger age, elementary school. Because one of the things that is really important is to know what you're reading and to really be able to figure out, is this something that's plausible? Does this source really seem to be credible? Can I believe what this person is saying? And that only happens over time. It's something that has to be taught, I think. And so that would be one of the things that I would advocate for, a new generation of news consumers.
I have a lot of I have a lot of thoughts on this, and part of that is, at least in Illinois, we have seen, as I noted, outlets that are certainly coming at it from a very biased point of view. And you will see them in newspapers, particularly where there have been layoffs, smaller staffs, and they still need to fill the pages. And if you look, Illinois News Network sounds, okay, that's super reasonable, right? It's just the Illinois News Network, when in fact that is connected to the Liberty Justice Center, which funded the recent Janice case. And you really do need to do your research and look. And frankly, some of the journalists that work for that outlet do a very good job, and they're hardworking. But to me, that is just one example. Even I think there are some news consumers who don't know the difference between an editorial and an actual newspaper or a news article, and a column versus a news article. And perhaps that is an examination that the media needs to have as well. Is this properly labeled? Am I making this obvious to somebody who isn't reading a newspaper with that nuance, or on a TV program? This is where we are now going to, yes, be sharing someone's opinion. It is an opinion, but it is not coming from Judy Woodruff. It is coming from somebody who is on the program, and then we will share an opposite point of view the next day. And I think it is incumbent upon us to share more of that, and it is part of news literacy from a younger age. And it's part of, I mean, believe me, I've got my phone right here. Yes, I'm constantly on my phone and tweeting out the latest news, but sometimes when you are in a rush, you're going to not tell the full story in 140 or 240 characters, whatever it is. Or maybe there is a mistake and you need to follow up, and how I handle it is, instead of just pressing delete and hoping, ooh, shoot, that'll go away, you go back and you say, hello, attention, so that everybody who flagged it and saw it, you hope as many eyeballs are back on that tweet. This is the correction, and we need to further be very careful about what we put out there. And so that's, I guess, some advice to students, but also things that I think about on a daily basis is I try and speak with people who aren't as vested in me as I am in following news and elections and politics, and how are they looking at things?
Exactly.
I was just going to say, I think it has become more, it's just challenging on a day-to-day basis in a different way to be a journalist today. I talked to some students today at the wonderful Free Spirit Media program that some of you may be familiar with in downtown Chicago. But we talked about how you are expected now to not only go out and report your own story, but you're expected to have done the background work. You need to know how to shoot that story on whatever video device you have to make sure that you got good audio, that people could hear it, that there was decent lighting, that your subject was lit. This is if you're working, if you're not just taking notes as a newspaper reporter, but frankly, even newspaper reporters now are expected to understand. Everybody's got to know how to. The job is not as simple as it was when I started out. All I had to know how to do was write and report. And as I said, learn how to hold the microphone. But today, journalists are asked to do a lot. And on top of that, get it all right. And on top of that, when you do make a mistake, acknowledge it right away. I think transparency today is more important than it's ever been because, as Amanda said, we all make mistakes, we're all human, and we need to be transparent with you, the people who read us, watch us, listen to us, and let you know what we're dealing with.
So speaking of making mistakes, we know in the last year we've had a lot of coverage, particularly with the Me Too movement, about men behaving poorly, especially in the news industry. Just this summer, I had a group of students, and a couple of them are there in the back, incoming freshmen, where we talked about what it's like to be a woman in the industry. And I'd like to know, given the history that you've had in the industry, and now that people are coming forward, and again, not just in the news media, but all over. I mean, even here on our campus in Medill, we've kind of had our own Me Too movement, but Me Too incident. And from transparency standpoint, I think we have to acknowledge that. What advice would you give young women who are going into the industry? Because as part of Journalism 101, we tend to talk about how to write a lead, how to shoot your video, how to make sure you get a great interview, how to put the story together. But we often are not talking about some of the things that could occur in the newsroom. I'm starting to talk about that more with my students. What advice would you give them?
Well, I think what's happened in the last year or so is very healthy for all of us. I mean, we all know that there have been, over time, I mean, our society has changed. The expectations of behavior have changed. Things that people could get away with decades ago, even 5 years ago, are not tolerated anymore. We live in a different time. Women are rightly, finally, expecting, demanding, insisting on being treated with respect. And it's a long time coming. You could argue, well, it should have happened decades ago. Yes, it should have happened 100 years ago. But women entered the workforce, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s especially. And it's taken us this long to come to this kind of reckoning. And unfortunately, it had to take the disclosures that we've been dealing with over the last year. I don't think that what's happened in the past year does away with it, with the challenge. I think it's there. I think the best thing that women and men can do, we're all in this together, is to have open conversations about it, to make sure that men and women, again, coming into the industry, know what's expected of them. You are expected to treat everyone with respect. Women, men, everyone. I mean, it doesn't matter across gender. And I think what you have to talk about when you talk about Me Too is a power relationship, because so many of the situations that we've seen were about a power imbalance. And today, as women rise in the ranks of journalism and have positions of power, I think it puts them in a position to speak up for themselves and to speak up for other women. And men. I mean, we know this happens men to men, women to women. This is not just a men to women issue that we're facing. But I'm so thankful that we're now having these conversations that we couldn't even have for the longest time.
I want to get back to you, because you are a manager, and so that is significant. But while we're speaking about the Me Too movement, I think that also speaks to the sisterhood of women journalists. And it's not just you. I mean, you mentioned Leslie Stahl. You worked with Andrea Mitchell. I know I can offer from my personal experience that I have a solid group of women. And yes, we compete with one another. And particularly in the Capitol, in the press room, we'll be frantically filing on deadline. And yet go out to dinner afterward and talk about it and say, can you believe that? Did you get that right? How did you do that? And we are there to both compete with one another, but very much to support one another. And that has been very powerful for me, particularly as we confront some of these more difficult situations, and even how to cover Me Too incidents, and particularly those where you get a tip, and how to make sure that you're following through on that in a responsible fashion. So can you speak to your sisterhood?
No, there is truly a sisterhood. I mean, the women, because there were so few of us to begin with, and when I started covering the White House, it was Ann Compton was covering for ABC, and that was about Marilyn Berger, who had been a Washington Post reporter, was covering for NBC. I joined NBC. Eventually, Leslie Stahl came along with CBS, and then Andrea Mitchell joined later on when I was moving from the White House to the Today Show for NBC. But that was the early days, and there were so few of us you could count it on the fingers of one hand. As there were more of us, I think we went from being pitted against one another, which was, I think, frankly, what was happening in the very early days. We would be compared, how is so-and-so doing compared to her over there? How is she doing compared?
Both on stories and looks, I'm guessing.
I'm sure that's the case. But what I want to say is that as numbers grew, women were able to establish friendships and this kind of sisterhood. I think that's a great way of putting it, that gives us the ability to stand together, to talk together, to share our own experiences, and we're all, we're in a better place because of that. Andrea Mitchell is one of my closest friends. She's the godmother to our daughter. We are very close. Leslie and I stay in touch, and of course, so many women. Our executive producer at the NewsHour, Sarah Just, is a woman. A number of I'm sure you all who watch the NewsHour, you see Lisa Desjardins, you see Yamiche Alcindor, Amna Nawaz, who was just joined us this year, and others. And we believe having women on board, supporting each other is important. Not as an anti-guy thing, that's not what this is about, but it is a way, I think, of sharing experiences that didn't happen before. We've all heard about the Old Boys Network. Yes, that's out there, that's great, they play golf, they do whatever they do, that's important too, but women, I think, have to be close as well.
You know, a lot of people might not even know that you're a manager because we do tend to put so much emphasis on who's in front of the camera. I'm curious how you might convince a young person to really consider management, particularly women who, again, as they move into those roles, can actually move up into those top-level management positions.
Well, it wasn't something that I necessarily sought. I started out as a reporter, and I thought all I ever want to do is report. I want to go out, I want to cover stories, I want to talk to people, and I want to bring those stories back and get them across. But as I moved along and moved from local television to NBC and then to PBS, took a little detour to CNN and then back to PBS, the responsibilities come with, and I think that's as it should be. When Jim Lehrer was the anchor, co-anchor of the NewsHour for many years, he was also managing editor, and Robin McNeil was the executive editor. So this comes with the turf. The people who are on the air should be determining what stories we're doing, and I play a critical role, along with our executive producer, in making those decisions. I want young women to think of themselves as capable of doing that, and it's a question of self-confidence. It's a question of imagining themselves in a management role. Right now, women have come a very long way in journalism. We still don't have enough women, I would say, writing opinion columns for our newspapers and other online sources. We don't have enough women doing that. We don't have enough women in management, purely running networks, running news organizations. We have a few, we've singled them out, but we need more. And frankly, we need more people of color. We are way behind where we should be in our correspondent corps in terms of covering the news in Washington. We have made a lot of progress, but we still have a very long way to go. I think our newsroom, like every newsroom, should look like the people we cover. We should look like America. The NewsHour should, because we cover this country, we cover the world. I think Chicago newscast should look like Chicago. I think that's how it doesn't mean it has to be the precise ratio of the population. It just means that we are more, I think, credible in the work we do, and more, I think, we demonstrate our commitment when we bring people into our newsroom who come from all parts of our wonderful country and our wonderful society.
Well, and also because the audience is changing, right? We also, if we want to be relevant to the future as the U.S. becomes a browner nation, we have to make sure that there are people in those newsrooms that represent the people in those populations. So I think we're going to open it up to questions. So get your questions ready. Who wants to raise their hand first? All right, that gentleman right there in the beige jacket.
We really appreciate the NewsHour, and we really appreciate Shields and Brooks.
Thank you. So do we.
And you know what can be done. We live in a time of such polarization and a sort of demonizing that goes back and forth with people on the other side. What can be done to create more genuine dialogue? Especially, it's just a matter of fact that we have a president right now that does not do that. That's just not part of who he is, to bring people together. It's actually, it seems fomenting divisiveness, but we really have to find a way to hear one another in a civil way. What are some things that can be done to expand that? Make MSNBC people sit down with Fox News people or something, I don't know.
There's an idea. It's such an important question, and I'm sure you won't be surprised to know, sir, that I get this question all over the country, whether I'm in Montana, or I was in North Dakota just weekend before last. People are asking that question everywhere, in the South, in the West, in the Northeast, because they see how divided this country is. In a way, I think that we've never, yes, we've been divided. We had a civil war. We got through that. We've been divided over the war in Vietnam. We've been divided over civil rights, over women's rights, over the immigration today, and so many other really important issues. And those are debates worth having. But we should, to the best of our ability, try to have those debates in a civil way. It's not to say people don't have a right to get angry, don't have a right to express their views, but it's the denigrating of the other side. It's the belittling of the other side. It's sort of like, I can't even imagine spending time with somebody who thinks that way. And I hear stories now all the time about families that are divided, that can't have Thanksgiving or Christmas or other, whatever their religious faith is, holidays together, because they're split in their politics. And so politics matters, but we need to keep trying to find ways to work together. It doesn't mean it's going to be kumbaya, we're all going to agree on everything. That's not what I'm talking about, and I don't think that's what anybody wants. But we need to find a way to respect each other, and that's what I think has fallen away. And I wish I could tell you that I had the answer for how to do it. I think one way is, two ideas. One is that we need leaders who model that. Leaders who model working across the aisle. My husband, Al Hunt, who's back there in the row, the guy with the white hair over in the corner, is a longtime journalist. He's been doing this even longer than I have, by only a couple of years. But he worked for the Wall Street Journal for a long time, and for the last 15 years, he's been with Bloomberg News and Bloomberg View. He was pointing out today, reminding us that, you know, there have been plenty of times on Capitol Hill when Republicans and Democrats basically came to the rescue of the other party to get, it was Strom Thurmond, Al, who worked, was it on the Panama Canal? Have I got it backward? No, all right. I'm gonna have Al stand up and tell the story, because he told it earlier today. There are some extraordinary examples of how Democrats have reached across the aisle to work with Republicans to get something done for the good of the country, and the same thing in the other direction. And right now, we don't see that. We see each side sort of going into their respective corners. People are calling it tribalism or tribes. I don't like that term, but that's one of the convenient terms that's been used.
I want to add here that, as I noted, because I read your book, you were pretty darn prescient in a whole lot of ways. And the final chapter is about the future. And you speak about how at one day in the future, AKA now, televisions will be used, and television/computers, I think works here, to shop, bank, deliver mail even, and that is very much the case. This is 1982, and also the proliferation even then of channels and networks and sources that people could go to for their news. And that, to me, is part of what makes bringing it to the middle so difficult, or at least having those conversations, because while it is no longer the networks and PBS that people have to turn to basically digest the news that is served to them, you can find your news. You can pick and choose what you want to hear, and that is one of the challenges. And I don't know how and if we should even put that genie back in the bottle, but nonetheless, that is, I think, an element that needs to, if there's ever going to be less of this tribalism or what have you, some way where people, I don't know. So there's the solution. Watch Chicago Tonight in the NewsHour, and everybody will be great. There you go. That's my answer.
We want to watch their version or the version that they believe in most. So I think that that's also an issue as well. Other questions? We want to make sure we get a few more in. Let's see. Nobody on this side? Okay, there's one. We'll go back and forth. We want equity here. We want to keep it even.
So I have a question about how you decide to report, or how you can shift the misinformation. And I'll use a very current example. There's a term that just came out in the past few days about a rogue murder, rogue people. And so now what happens is every time the report is done, like if we looked up rogue tomorrow, it probably has been reported hundreds of times. And the media, and you guys in particular even, seem to focus on that word, for example, all the time, or meddling is another example.
I'm
where
sorry, say that again, the second one?
meddling,
Meddling?
meddling in the election, as if what has happened in our elections is just meddling, just as small. So the use of language, it seems that as reporters, they're getting caught in using the language that the president has put forth, and they're not going beyond that. And I'm wondering, like, what do you see as your responsibility to both report it, but because it comes first, that's what people remember, So now this latest murder in Turkey is going to be, I think, described as a rogue effort rather than clear-cut murder and butchering, which, so how do you deal with those kinds of issues, which seem to happen on a daily basis? Like, determine what the actual language is.
No, you're right. I mean, once the president uses the term, that was such a surprising comment on his part, to be the first person, even before the Saudis said this. It was the president of the United States who said, it sounds like there may have been a group of rogue attackers, or whatever term that he used. And in any event, he was given credit for saying it. And the soundbite of President Trump saying it became a meme. It was over and over again. And then the Saudis, the reporting from the Saudis, non-really sourced, they didn't identify the sources, picked up on it. I actually would push back on that. I think that's happening to some extent, but if journalists are doing their job, they're not just going to live with the term or the label that President Trump put on it. They're going to do some deeper reporting. And I know today I've been reading some of the reporting just in the last few hours, and there's more information coming out about what may well have happened. We don't have proof yet, but the Turkish officials say they have some proof. We haven't seen it yet. But there's information coming out that is much more graphic and specific and tied to individuals who are tied to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. But I hear what you're saying. I mean, the president is very skillful at using language that gets picked up and gets repeated and becomes, as I said, a meme, and you just hear it repeated over and over again. And we have to be very careful not to fall in that trap, to stand back and look at it and say, okay, what is this? And how are we going to report on it? And what more do we need to know? And not just use that easy label, because it can be. It means we're lazy if we're not doing more than that.
The other thing I would add is I think it's incumbent upon viewers, listeners, and readers, when they see something like that, to call it out with a professional email, not denigrating the individual, but saying, I noticed that your newscast is doing XYZ, and I wonder why you are doing that, or what else you could do to prevent that word, or to be more specific, more precise about your use of language. Because you got to remember that the vetting process, this is happening at breakneck speed as people are looking at material. And sometimes there may be the rush to get it on and maybe not thinking as critically. And the buck does stop with whoever approved that copy. But at the same time, if you see something, don't be afraid to send a friendly email, because I think that is helpful when news organizations want to get feedback.
We read our viewer mail.
Yeah, they want that feedback, but they won't know it unless you give it.
Briefly here, I think part of the challenge is, the president said it. He used the words, and so it is true that gets repeated. That's how you tell a story. That is the news. By its very nature, that those words were uttered became the story. And so it is, to me, part of this in-depth kind of question of accountability that the industry has to have, and a good journalist does point that out. But my quote isn't what's going to be the headline or what is going to be the easy Google search. That's the easy Google search. And so we need to both, I think, pay attention to that in our reporting, and it does get back to being an educated, smart consumer of news and realizing, well, okay, you've got to read more than the headline, because you'll probably get more than rogue. But yeah, that is going to be the top hit when you go on the internet.
Okay, we'll go to this side. How about the gentleman in the black right there in the middle? That's you. If you could wait for the mic. Thank you.
Yes, so every time I see a poll or something come out about the NewsHour, they always say how it's very balanced between both sides, right and left. So I was just wondering if you could talk to a little bit how you maintain that balance and what some of the challenges might be on a day-to-day basis. Are there stories that you might want to do, but you feel like it might be too left-leaning of a segment then for that day that you have to not do some stories that you want to do? Can you just elaborate a little bit?
Well, it's clearly something we think about, especially in this polarized environment that we're talking about right now. There are some stories that we don't have to, there's some science stories, for example, or the art stories that related to the arts, or just, events, hurricanes and so forth. We don't. But once politics plays any role in a story, you find yourself sometimes often having to think about, all right, in our reporting, we've heard from one side and we know there's another side, how much time do we have? Are we able to give both sides of the story? How big of an argument is it? Can we tell part of the story tonight and say tomorrow night we'll talk to someone on the other side? Can we interview a Republican tonight and a Democrat tomorrow? We've often done that, covering the Kavanaugh hearings, and you don't get much more divisive than that. We would talk to one senator one night and one another night. Sometimes we would do two together. But it has to be part of our calculation. Having said that, I don't think it serves the audience well to seek this sort of artificial 50-50 thing where you're just trying to cut it down the middle and we're going to give you 50% of it. I mean, that's physically impossible. We try, and for example, when we have two senators on, we try, Democrat and Republican, we try very hard to get it down to the same 6 minutes and 6 minutes, or 7 minutes and 7 minutes. But often it's not that simple. I mean, for example, I interviewed Al Gore the other night on the NewsHour, and this was off of that major UN report on climate change, which is, if you haven't looked at it, is incredibly depressing, because it says we're going to be facing rising seas and frankly, effects that are going to change our lives our children's lives, not just our grandchildren, but our children's lives in the next couple of decades. And we wanted to have Al Gore on because the role he played in calling attention to the issue. So I was comfortable putting Gore on by himself to talk about that. I tried to pose the questions of some of the climate doubters and so forth, but frankly, we're now at a point where there are very few scientists who do not go along with climate change. So we've come a long way on that. But yes, it is something that we have to think about. We think that's our responsibility. And viewers write in about it. If they think we've been, we haven't heard enough from the right or we haven't heard enough from the left, and we welcome that. And we try to, we're constantly trying to hit some kind of balance and try to be fair, but not 50-50 perfect. You could drive yourself crazy trying to do that, and it doesn't serve the audience either.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you. We mentioned earlier that everyone wants to sort of pick or hear their version of the news, but I think what drives me crazy about that is that the news shouldn't have a version. And I feel like, the NewsHour does an excellent job of that. And so it starts me to think, well, how much does funding and the funding of news, like the TV, is that really part of the culprit? Because there shouldn't be versions of news. The news is the news. So it's the opinions, so I'm just curious about how much you think money is a driving factor behind the divisive things that you hear from different stations.
I think money may play some role, but I think as I look back on modern American journalism, and I want Ava and Amanda to weigh in on this, I think back to, our country we've not always had, as I'm sure you know, what we call the sort of objective journalism of today. I personally don't believe objectivity is possible. We're human. I think trying to be fair is the best we can do. But there was a time early on in the history of this country when there were nothing but opinionated newspapers and journals. That was the way news was created in this country. It really wasn't until the early part of the 20th century when we moved in the direction of trying to tell both sides. It was part of the social development of the country. It was the journalism I learned. It was the journalism I became familiar with, but it isn't what's always been around. We've now, though, come to a point with Rupert Murdoch creating the Fox News channel, with, I don't know, think of the other very successful conservative outlets that are out there, I don't know, name the magazines, that Breitbart News, the online outlets. There's so many of them. I don't think there's so much, yes, there's money behind them, but there is this sense of grievance on their part. They feel that they have a point of view that has not been adequately reflected in the so-called mainstream media. That was the genesis of Fox News Channel. You see that on the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the sense that you're not hearing this from most of the news. We're here to tell you something you're not finding anywhere else. So that's where it came from, and since then it's morphed. I mean, it's in many different parts of our news environment. I want to hear Ava's thought on this.
But the thing that I want to add is, Judy's right about the history of the media. You know, as we move into mass media, I mean, one of the reasons to have more objective news and the other side is so that I can get ad dollars from that other side, right? So I do think money has a major role when it comes to journalism. And we see certain journalism organizations closing their doors over the last 5 years or so, because that business model no longer works. And so I think those organizations that are more niche publications, or whether they're digital, and most of them are digital, they have to go where the money is, right? Because if you don't have money, then you're not able to sustain. I was just talking to someone today, a Chicago area person who has a news organization, and I won't necessarily name the name, but they're struggling to make ends meet. And if they're not able to raise funds for this particular publication, they're going to be out of business in a few months. So I don't think we can deny that money plays a role. I mean, we all see the ads that are on TV, right? One after another, repeating the ads over. So this is a great time in terms of our elections that are coming up, because stations make a lot of money during this time period. Now, that's not their only reason for existing, obviously. So I don't want to imply that, but I do think you do have to consider capitalism always in the equation.
Just to quick clarify, I don't mean to suggest that money doesn't play a role in journalism. It certainly does, and we're now in a place where young people think news is for free, and that's contributed to the collapse. I mean, newspapers are dying all over the country. It's how many tens of thousands of reporters have lost their jobs in this country because the business model doesn't work. So I think the money is an important question, but in terms of driving opinion in journalism, I think there is a real sense of grievance on the part of many conservatives. They feel their views are just not adequately reflected in the media.
What I want to also make clear on that is, yes, certainly money is a driver for the people who own the stations and the newspapers, but there is, in every newsroom that I have been a part of or been witness to, very much a wall between that side and the decisions that are made in terms of what to cover on a show, in a program. So when we have our Chicago Tonight editorial meetings, we don't say, oh, hey, they just donated, so let's do a story on that. It is most certainly not that. We don't ever take that into consideration, and I'm sure that is the case as well with the NewsHour. So money is a driver, and I also think we need to recognize when I say that people can choose their news, it is in part really because of cable more than, quote, mainstream, and also the internet. I mean, that's what it is. You have people that aren't watching an hour-long news program or reading a newspaper from cover to cover. They are going to Twitter and going to Facebook, and those are their cultivated news sources, and that is what is driving this wedge, frankly, is what it is. So when I say people are choosing the news, by and large, that's what I mean.
I think someone had a question on this side. Yes. A student, perhaps.
So you all are public faces when it comes to the news, and how do you deal with some of the negative comments you might get being in that role? I like to write opinion articles, and my skin is only so thick. So when those other opinions come rolling at you, what do you do? What do you suggest?
Well, I'm not an opinion columnist like you, but journalists today just have to have a thick skin. And we're used to not being loved. I mean, politicians don't love the press. I don't know a single president I covered, Democrat or Republican, who thought they got a fair shake from the news media. They all left office thinking, this was pretty rotten, I wasn't treated fairly. Tell me, do you think George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, they all think that the press did them wrong? I think we're at a kind of a new place today with the relationship that we have between the president and the press. But my point is that the press is used to that, and you've got to stiffen it up and just not worry about it. But you do have to have a thick skin, because people write, and people today feel much freer to tell you exactly what they think, and they can do it in real time. They can send it in a tweet. They don't have to write a letter, or they don't have to pick up a phone.
Sometimes they need to think before they write and click send, I think. But to your point, it is, the research shows that if you are a woman and you are a writer, you are actually more likely to get trolls and others writing very negative things about what you write. So there are some organizations like Troll Busters that are out there trying to work with women, in particular women writers who are being, really people are going after them electronically, sometimes to the point of news organizations having to move them from their homes and move their children from their homes. Those are certainly rare cases, but those are cases to consider. So, I would say we need to be more civil, but some of us are not. And I do think that developing that thick skin is really important, and also developing a plan. Some women have actually filed police reports in situations like that, and often the police departments aren't really sure what to do, in those situations. So I think news organizations have to be prepared probably for more of that, and really put a plan in place should those kinds of comments rise to the level of real danger.
I just want to make a point before we go further. This goes without saying, and you all know this here, for all the tough time that we're talking about the press having in this country, and we definitely are facing a rockier moment than we have had during my career, but compared to what journalists face around the rest of the world, we have it so much better in this country, because we can write and speak and challenge and hold our public officials accountable without being afraid that we're going to be taken out back and shot or fired or have our news organization disappear the next day, which is what happens in so many countries. I mean, if you, I'm sure you all have looked at this, but when you look at the list of countries in the world, the places where there's truly a free press is a small percentage. Most countries, governments crack down. Leaders do not like to be criticized. They don't, and even if there are some print organizations writing about them, they will control the broadcast organs, and they just will put them out of business, shut them down if they don't like what they're doing. We see it happening today in every continent on Earth. I mean, Mexico. Look at Turkey, China. I mean, there just isn't a free press in so many of these places on the African continent, South America, and I could go on.
Yeah, that context is very important. I think one last question. Yes. Hold on, if you just hold for the mic.
Thanks. More of a Workday question. When you do the news, you do it to 4 different time zones, and you're on the air, and then I don't know if you're on at a different time in the same time zone, and then you're on an hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. And I was wondering what obligations you have to update the later time zones, and have you found yourself on the way home thinking my workday is over and I got to go back, something's going on, and how does that work?
That's a great question, and it's actually a great question to wrap up with because it really does get at the reality of news today. It is nonstop. There are no workday is over moments. We do try to do only one version of the NewsHour from 6 to 7 Eastern in Washington, actually in Arlington, Virginia, where our studio is. We get it on the air, and we try not to make mistakes that have to be corrected at 7. We hope that there aren't news developments that we have to update for 7 and beyond. But we will do it if the news is important enough, if it's big enough. Why do I say we don't want to do it? Is because it costs money. We are frugal in public broadcasting. I mean, everybody, nobody's trying to throw money around. But we have to be frugal. And every time we keep the studio, the lights on and the crew there longer, we're paying them overtime. All of us, those who are salaried hourly employees, have to be paid, and it costs money. So there are nights when we're making a tough call. Is this important enough to wait? I will tell you that on election night, on November the 6th, we're going to be there all night because that's a huge story, and we're going to be there on top of it. We feel that way about every major story. But some nights we have to make a tough call, and we have to say, okay, we're going to cut it off at 7 or we're going to cut it off at 8, and our audience is going to have to wait for tomorrow night. But we do discuss it. I mean, it's a subjective decision. And believe me, news is breaking at night, every night, from 6, we go on the air. We were about to go on the air the night Jim Comey was fired. We had to completely throw the show out and start from scratch. I mean, and this happens a lot these days. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Judy, Amanda, thank you so much for being here this evening. It was great having you at Medill and at Northwestern. And thank you, our audience, for being so pleasant. Questions?
Thank you all.